All right, today we're diving into the really fascinating and honestly kind of weird world of genetics. We're going to uncover how genes don't just act on their own, but how they actually influence, silence, and work together in some pretty surprising ways.
We often think of genetics as being pretty straightforward, right? Like a simple blueprint, one gene, one trait. There's a gene for blue eyes, a gene for tall plants. But what if it's more like a really complex team sport, where the final score, the final outcome, depends entirely on how all the players interact on the field?
So to really get why some genetic results are so strange, we first have to understand the basic rules. And in genetics, the rulebook was pretty much written by Gregor Mendel and his famous pea plants. He gave us a world that was predictable and really quite elegant.
And this right here is the big one, Mendel's famous dihybrid cross. What he did was look at two different traits at the same time, like seed shape and seed color. When he crossed the offspring, he almost always found this beautiful, consistent 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio. This became the benchmark, It's what you expect to see when two different genes are doing their own thing, completely independent of each other. But science never sits still. Not long after Mendel's work was rediscovered, scientists like William Bateson started getting results that, they just didn't add up. The math was off. Those neat, predictable patterns were totally breaking down, which suggested something much more complicated was happening under the hood.
Let me show you one of the classic puzzles that really stumped these early geneticists. So they took two pure-breeding sweet pea plants. Both of them had white flowers. Simple enough, you'd think. You cross a white flower with another white flower, you expect to get, white flowers, right?
But they didn't. The offspring were all purple. A color that wasn't even in the parents suddenly just appeared. And then it got even weirder. When they crossed these purple flowers, their kids showed up in a strange 9 to 7 ratio of purple to white. Not Mendel's neat 9-3-3-1. This was a total mystery that needed a brand new explanation.
And the solution to this puzzle has a name: epistasis. This is where the story gets really good, because we're moving away from thinking about genes as solo acts and starting to see them as a whole genetic orchestra.
So what is it exactly? Well, to put it simply, epistasis is when one gene can basically hide or completely mask the effect of another gene. And this other gene is at a totally different spot in the genome. It's like a genetic veto power. One gene's ability to express itself is completely at the mercy of another gene. William Bateson, the guy who coined the term, got the name from Greek roots that mean standing upon. And that's exactly what he saw. It looked like some gene variations were literally standing over others, just blocking their effects from ever showing up.
Okay, so let's get the lingo straight, because it's helpful. The gene that's doing the masking, the one in charge, that's called the epistatic gene. Think of it as the boss. The gene that gets silenced, its effect gets hidden, that's the hypostatic gene. It's there, it's got instructions, but the epistatic gene is telling it to stay quiet.
And here's the thing, this isn't just one single phenomenon. Epistasis comes in a bunch of different flavors, and each one creates its own unique modified Mendelian ratio. It really all depends on the specific way the genes in a particular pathway are talking to each other.
So let's go back to our sweet pea puzzle and see how this actually works. It turns out that purple color is made in a two-step biochemical assembly line. Gene A makes an enzyme that turns a colorless molecule into another colorless molecule. Then gene B makes an enzyme that turns that molecule purple. So to get a purple flower, you need at least one working copy of both genes. If either gene A or gene B is broken, the assembly line stops cold and you're left with a white flower. And this explains perfectly how we get that strange 9 to 7 ratio. See, out of the 16 possible combinations, only the 9 that have at least one dominant A and one dominant B can finish the job and make that purple pigment. The other 7 combinations, they're missing a working enzyme at step 1 or step 2 or maybe even both, so they all end up looking exactly the same, white. Mystery solved.
This type of interaction is called recessive epistasis, and you can see a beautiful example of it in the coat colors of Labrador retrievers. So you've got one gene, the B gene, that decides if the pigment is going to be black or brown. But then a second gene, the E gene, acts like a master switch. It decides whether any of that pigment actually gets put into the fur in the first place. So here's what happens. If a lab has 2 copies of that little E allele, it literally doesn't matter what the B gene is saying, black or brown. No dark pigment is going to be deposited. The gene for deposition is effectively switched off. And this is how we get our 3 classic lab colors and that modified 9-3-4 ratio, 9 black, 3 brown, and 4 yellow labs. But the bossy gene isn't always the recessive one. Check this out. It can be dominant too, like in summer squash. Here, a dominant W allele at one gene actively blocks color from being made, which makes the squash white. It's only if the plant has two recessive W alleles that a second gene, the Y gene, can finally get a word in and make the squash yellow or green. So in this case, just a single copy of that dominant W allele is powerful enough to veto any color production. This means a whopping 12 out of the 16 possible combinations end up as white squash. The 4 that are left over, the WW ones, can then be yellow or green, giving us this totally different 12 to 3 to 1 ratio. Okay, so all these classic examples of peas and labs and squash, they're not just some historical fun facts. Understanding epistasis is actually more critical now than it has ever been, especially in the age of modern genomics.
Epistasis is really a double-edged sword for scientists. On one hand, it's an amazing tool. By watching how different mutations interact, researchers can literally map out incredibly complex pathways in our cells, figuring out which gene acts before another. But on the other hand, it's a huge hurdle. It makes finding the genes for complex diseases so much harder, because any single gene's effects could be hidden or tweaked by dozens of others. And to really get a sense of the mind-boggling scale of this challenge, consider this. In the genome of simple baker's yeast, there are over 18 million possible interactions just between pairs of genes. In humans, that number is just astronomical. This is the big data problem of modern genetics.
And this brings us to a really critical point. The reason we have such a hard time finding the one gene for common diseases like heart disease or diabetes is probably because there isn't one. It's way more likely that these conditions come from a complex, tangled network of genes, where the effect of any single gene depends entirely on the context of all the others. So, what are the big takeaways here? First, genes are not solo artists. They're team players, part of these huge networks. Second, epistasis is the name we give to the phenomenon that explains why real-world genetics often looks a lot messier than a simple high school Punnett square. And finally, figuring out this giant web of interactions is one of the biggest challenges and biggest goals of modern biology and medicine.
And that leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. For a long time, our approach to genetics has been to find a single cause for a single effect. But if epistasis has taught us anything, it's that the interactions might be way more important than the individual parts. Maybe the future of genetics isn't about hunting for a single gene, but about trying to map the entire network.